Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's ServiceNow webinar. Today, we are talking about DevOps and ITOps and how to strike a balance between those two. My name is Craig McDonough. I am from ServiceNow. And I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Troy DeMullen, who's the VP of Research and Development at Pink Elephant, and we'll hand over to him in just a second. But before we do, I wanted to step through a couple of quick housekeeping items just to get everyone on the same page before we get into the content of the webinar. First of all, we are taking questions and answers during the course of the webinar today. So if you have any questions, just click on the question panel, type your question in, and we will get to it. That could be anything at all. It could be a technical question about something you can't hear, or maybe a question about the content that's being delivered, maybe sort of a follow-on question from something that Troy or myself share with you. So feel free to type that in at any point, and we will get to as many of those as we can during the course of the webinar and at the end of the session as well. In addition to that, I wanted to let you know that today's session is being recorded. So if for whatever reason you need to drop off partway through, or if you think the webinar is so great that you want to share it with all of your friends and family, you will receive a link in the follow-up email that you get after this webinar, that you can use to go back and replay the webinar. So you can get back and watch it again, maybe pick up on something that you missed the first time through. So with that all said, before I hand over to Troy, I just want to make sure that you've got a good understanding of what we're going to be talking about today. These are some of the topics that you'll hear us discuss, and I'm not going to read through the agenda, but you'll certainly hear us talking through each of these topics during the course of the webinar today. And there'll also be discussion around how ServiceNow helps you strike a balance between DevOps and ITOps as well. So that will all be part of the conversation. But before I hand over to Troy, I just wanted to give a quick introduction for those of you who are not completely familiar with ServiceNow, just to sort of let you know who we are, in case you haven't come across us before. So ServiceNow is the enterprise cloud company. We have a cloud-based service that modernizes and transforms the enterprise. Not only has ServiceNow taken the service management market by storm, but we're also the fastest growing cloud company in the history of cloud. And I want to just sort of make a point. I'm not saying this to pat ourselves on the back. It's important because it's a barometer of where large companies, our customers, are investing. We believe that IT is the backbone of the modern enterprise. And our customers are investing in cloudifying the enterprise. They're making every attempt to kill the traditional old-fashioned help desk in favor of pushing the workflow to the requester. They're disintermediating service transactions with automation, and they're expanding service management into an enterprise discipline. And they're the reasons why ServiceNow has experienced such tremendous growth. Again, it's not about us. It's an indicator of where the companies that view IT as a strategic competitive advantage are investing. But some other quick facts and figures about ServiceNow you can see on the screen there. Just shy of 3,000 customers around the world, and a little bit over that in employees and sites all over the planet. But enough about us. I would like to now hand over to our special guest for the webinar today, Troy DeMullen. Again, he's the VP of Research and Development at Pink Elephant. G'day, Troy.
Hello, Craig. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
All right. So awesome. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today around the whole balancing act around service management and DevOps. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what these things are. And, you hear the typical, well, now DevOps is here. We need IT service management and vice versa. It's almost like we always see this kind of pendulum swing to both extremes. The reality is it's not so extreme, and in fact, there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. I actually wrote an interesting paper on the fact that I coined the phrase that DevOps and ITSM, two sides of the same coin in perspective of understanding value creation. And what we'll talk about in this session is the difference between functional and non-functional requirements, and both are necessary in creating and delivering value. To kind of get this started, though, let's acknowledge a little bit of an interesting dilemma that we have in our industry, and that's that we're all schizophrenic. We all have multiple voices in our heads that we have to pay attention to, and at various points in your organization's growth and evolution, some of these voices are more predominant than others, but they all exist at the same time. So, using lean premises, which, by the way, is kind of the foundation around a lot of the principles of DevOps and agile software development and service management as well. We begin with the end in mind, as was once said, with the fact that the voice of customer on the left-hand side kind of drives the basis of how you define value. We look at it from an outside in, as my friend Ian Clayton likes to talk about, in the fact of, value is created and understood in the concept of the service consumer. So this is where in the agile space we talk about user stories and understanding ethics and how do we understand how to deliver on value based on what customers are willing to pay for if given the choice. And again, that's a kind of a lean principle, voice of customer or VOC. And with all that wonderful set of demand that's coming in, we get this nice product backlog that basically keeps us employed for the next couple of years. That's all good. But the problem with that product backlog, that's inventory standing in front of my value system, kind of queuing up. So there's this need to move fast to get through this inventory because, time is money. That's on our left-hand side. But at the same time, if you were to deliver what your customer wanted, but you didn't protect their data or you did something that put them in jail, they wouldn't thank you for it. So there's other voices we have to also consider. The voice of business, where we consider things like, hey, I can do that, but it's going to put you out of pocket this much, and we might go broke doing that. As voice of legislation, yeah, that would be cool, but if we did that, orange jumpsuits just don't suit you. So let's not go there. And then there's the voice of process, meaning, one of the things that we try to do in the concept of both service management and around assurance is making sure that we have the right risk identified and managed, but also let's not do stuff we don't need to. How do we improve and reduce lead time and cycle time to get optimized flow going through our value stream? So as you can see, all of these voices are critical to pay attention to. You can't just focus on one and not the other because we're just not going to have a scenario that will be pleasing. And again, your customer wouldn't thank you for it if you forgot to think about one of the voices. But here is a key thing to consider. When you're having those discussions around demand, your customer will have lots of dialogue around feature, function, things that the thing must do. This is the user stories around functional requirements. But they'll expect you to have their best interest and their back, and that's the context of non-functional requirement. They won't explicitly decry or decree those things, but it's still the responsibility of an IT professional to understand those requirements. So also I want to kind of bring to this context something about the concept of agility versus velocity. So agile, in fact, the favorite terms and words you hear out there today is agile, lean, nimble, small batch, scrum, quick. These things are all things you hear today. But I want to talk to you about the premise of systems thinking. Now, a system, and for the moment, just think about a system of all these different people. Right here, we call them agents in a system. They all have a part to play, and that system, as we're going to see, can be initial conversations with the customers around their user stories, and then a design activity happens, and then people get involved in the build activities via various methods. They have to then test and validate that, and then move it to production and support it. So think of this kind of value system, generically demand, plan, build, run, or in the ITIL sense, you have the strategy, design, transition, operations, same thing, different words. But imagine if all the various agents at different parts of this value stream all were being agile, each of them nimble in their own way, quick to jump when needed, but they all jumped in different directions because they didn't share values, priorities, practices, processes, tools. Imagine a world where agility is important, but shared understanding of what direction and priorities is not. Imagine the world you probably live in right now. So this is the challenge, is that Agile is great as long as everyone in the system is moving in the same general direction with the same value system. So this premise of having two different camps, dev and ops, under different flags, not a good idea from the point of view of generating velocity, because while development will actually, develop the potential for value, it's actually never realized until it's in run. So this concept of the complete value stream is critical to understand how to improve the velocity of value generation. So not only do we have concerns simply about having different priorities, again, take a little bit of a hard look, sometimes we don't even like each other. The challenge with this, and Craig used this word, enterprise strategy, is that for most organizations, enterprise is a myth. You have a dev strategy over here, times X actually, because you have multiple strategies, and you have an ops strategy over here, and there's little to no coherence between those strategies because they're not even perhaps conceived that way. And because we're not thinking of it from the point of view of value stream premise, we're struggling because we have different goals, both, by the way, which have to be achieved. Time is money is correct, but also stability and control are those voices we have to pay attention to. And with this differences of values, difference of culture, differences of belief, differences of leadership, differences of priority, differences of even liking each other, there's only one possible outcome in this scenario, and that's what it looks like. It's not my problem, that's your problem. So it's an interesting premise, the difference between a group and a team. So a group kind of is a group of individuals, agents in your system that all kind of work on stuff. A team, though, shares values, understands that they're mutually accountable, and that there is no such thing as it's your problem now, because it's always our problem. So this is a huge change in culture for our industry, which is right now oriented around silos, technical domains, without thinking of value streams and value systems. Now, this is a problem that the DevOps movement is trying to address, because DevOps is a major element of culture. In keywords like let's bring operational requirements forward into design. That's all good, and we're going to talk about that in the context of non-functional requirements. Let's make sure that we can validate that we don't pass errors down the line. It's called, in Lean, we call this shifting quality to the left, or first time right. And we do that through automated testing and design around the architecture that makes this architecture more resilient. So these are things that we can do in the context of bringing operational requirements forward into design. These are critical, and these are good things to do. Because we have to realize that there is no such thing as dev without ops. And the fact is, the reality is we're in this world of an integrated value stream, whether you want to use the plan, build, run, or whatever terms. We have activities that support customer engagement and demand management. We have activities around build, getting that stuff done. And then we have activities around run or operate. Ideally, we have an oversight, a governance council, a leadership cadre that basically looks at this as an end-to-end perspective. And again, I say ideally because in my experience, this is often a myth. And that CSI, continual improvement, is looking at ways to improve the entire value stream. So one of the things that's interesting, those of you who might be familiar with a book called The Goal from Eli Goldratt, he talks about a theory of constraints. And what he says in this is simply this. You have this system, like this one, for generating value, but that system cannot be any faster than its limiting bottleneck or constraint. So if you do all this development optimization, you imply agile software development methodologies, you're going small batch, but you never deal with, let's say, your move to production process, and that's a high friction, activity, then that system will never get faster than the bottleneck. So you can't optimize a non-bottleneck and expect higher velocity in your system. You have to look at it from the point of view of where is the current constraint and how do I ensure better flow. To do that, I have to understand that I'm only as strong as my weakest link. And that's the premise of systems thinking. Now, before you kind of think, okay, well, this guy's talking about everything in this perfect world, and I have this vision now of all these mature processes, That's not necessarily true either. To kind of give you a sense of how this works, think about this. In the center here, basically you have stuff that you govern and manage. You have a technical architecture. You basically figure out, how do I move this technical architecture from its current state to a target future state that I have defined as good. Service architecture. These are things which you produce today, outcomes that you generate: email, collaboration, hosting, storage. There's a target state for storage, and here's my current state, and how do I get there? Process. Everyone basically has a process architecture. You talk to your customers, you take requirements, you build out things, you move into production, you get to support it. And also, there's a target state, here's a future state. So I can speak to this now in any three of these key aspects. And the way you look at it is this. So there are some practices, technical architectures, etc., which we leave or have today in an engineer-to-order capacity. What that means is this, simply being, you come to me with a demand, I have some unique specialization, some technical knowledge, some tools at hand, and so I'm going to cook you up in the kitchen a unique, bespoke, custom solution. Then someone else comes to me, comes with basically the same demand with about 5% variance. I create them yet another custom spoke. And so I create this over time, custom, which has an impact. We'll come back to that. But they get highly tailored, unique offers developed just for them. Make to order is simply for the point of a period of time, we have a control, a process, a practice. But after that period of time is done, it's a limited time offer, it goes away. So you remember Y2K, we had great asset management discipline in 1999, but the party came and went, and after that asset management went away. Make to order. Assemble to order is the premise. Well, here's a technical architecture, and you have to use this base supplier, but you can use different models. Or here's a core process. At this core element, this has to be consistent, but you can vary up and down. This is like the Apple or Dell website where you can go on and you can order your different models and you can configure them up and down, but still within the agreed variability. You can't just add anything. So that's variability with some semblance of control. And over here on Make to Stock world, we say, okay, this thing must be true. It always comes off the assembly line the same way. Everyone uses a standard network. We all use a standard image. We all have a common process for support, a common change approach to production. So the premise here is that you have a range of capabilities in your process architecture, your technical, your service architecture. Now, if everything in this dial is hard right, there's a cause and effect. There's a causality. High degree of custom means high degree of variance, which means a high degree of complexity, which means a high degree of defect potential, which means a high degree of cost, and of course, speed goes down. However, interesting enough, you actually get more innovation. Now, you move that dial somewhere to the left, and you have a high degree of standardization. Now you have low variance, higher speed, lower cost, and you're mitigating risk, but you're also lowering innovation. So where am I going with all this? It's important to understand that this has a cause and effect both on speed and velocity, but also your ability to increase velocity in a predictable way. So DevOps talks a lot about automation, automating testing, automating deployment. And that's all good because that increases speed, reduces complexity, reduces defect, all of the things that are good. But those things still have to be standardized first. So a standard way to have a service catalog to basically start an automation process for provisioning. A standard way to do service orchestration using standard artifacts, standard server builds, etc. The reality is any organization has to look at its thing it's managing, the system it's managing, and make decisions that some stuff, like an engineering process, I'm going to leave over here because I actually value the innovation and I accept the consequence. But other things, I have to move somewhere to the left, not hard left, but somewhere in the context of this dial. So the reality is, while some things can be craft-oriented, we need some things to be standard to actually enable service management and DevOps. So a key aspect of DevOps and Agile is, we'll call it small batch premise. And this is not a originating principle within DevOps or Agile. This comes from the world of Lean. Small batch simply says, you know, I'm working on smaller packages of work, and because I'm working on smaller packages of work, I can be more agile if things change, if priorities change, and I can give you a look at seeing how this is looking at an earlier stage, because as soon as I show it to you, you're going to have lots more ideas. And so I go through this iterative design mode, which is, you know, based on the sprint principle of an agile world. And so small batching, aka, you know, sprints managed through a Scrum process perhaps, is all about iterative design of improvement over time. And so in the Agile world, this has been built into an entire methodology around standard estimation and understanding the user stories and getting incremental improvements based on their backlog and user stories. And we understand how to capture and, you know, measure sprint in the sense of a burn down chart. All of this really is all about improving velocity based on the Lean principles of small batch. So how do we now bring together the Lean, the Agile, and the service management principles? So it's interesting. We first begin with defining DevOps. What is that word? How do I define it? It's interesting because I've spoken to some people, and some of the purists will say, well, you can't really define DevOps because to define DevOps would be to kill it. I don't believe that. So here's, in my opinion, and I validated this opinion with several people in the DevOps community, is a good way to kind of look at what DevOps is. And it begins with this concept of Lean principles of value system orientation. We look at the end-to-end aspect of value creation. It also, with the Lean principles, believes about improving velocity. So that's getting to your premise of reducing cycle time and lead time, reducing waste, improving work in progress optimization. We do that through small batching, and we do that through, you know, rigorously going after removing the stuff no one cares about and going after the high value stuff. That's all good, that's all Lean. And that has now birthed, you know, a project management and a software development belief and premise, like the Agile discussion we just had on user stories and releases that contain sprints and sprints that can be measured through burn down charts, etc. So Agile is born out of that premise. Theory of constraints helps me to understand improving flow is a matter of identifying bottlenecks and dealing with bottleneck optimization and reduction. Not that you'll ever get rid of bottlenecks completely, but as long as the system of value flows at the speed that demand is coming in, you have equilibrium. So finding that balance of demand and supply is a principle that we learned from the Eli Goldratt model. In the DevOps world, we do get to this principle of speed in respect to what we'll call continuous integration. And we'll come back to that when we talk about trunk management in a few minutes. But the reality is, a good practice, as we're going to see, is to constantly be integrating into the code repository, the trunk, the master repository, the most up-to-date version of the code, so anyone currently working on this same service or application can actually be using the most up-to-date code that, you know, contains all the fixes and all the patches and all of the new features. And good trunk management is always going to help you speed up velocity and remove defect. But then we get to the concept of continuous delivery versus deployment, and that's actually two different words. Delivery is not often a lot said about continuous delivery versus continuous deployment, but you can still achieve your small batch premise. You can still achieve your goal of shortening your feedback loops between you and your user acceptance testing conversation and featured dialogue by putting that into a non-production scenario. So looking at, you know, defining when you actually go to a live deployment might actually use a branching strategy. We'll come back to that as well. So small things get get placed in, integrated in very quickly into production. But for larger things, I might actually get my small feedback loops and shorten feedback loops through a maybe non-production element. Now, to do all of this using automation just increases velocity. Again, another Lean premise. is different types of time. One type of time is machine time. And machine time is a way we automate and improve the velocity of anything by taking out the need of human intervention and resourcing. So we can do that through creating code-based testing scenarios where I do not move defects down the line. So I shift quality to the left, if you will, my value stream. But I also do that in the concept of once I have defined standard artifacts, even standard environments, I can push a button because now infrastructure could potentially be code and deploy what took me months now in the matter of seconds. As long, and this is key, as the developers are using standard pre-approved and pre-validated artifacts in doing so. Now, come into this is that this whole thing is actually going to be residing around a process architecture of service orientation. And that service orientation gets its genesis and its birth in the world of service management, because someone still has to define what the portfolio objectives are going to be for this year. Someone still has to just understand what are the supplier and the cyber and security requirements. And we're going to see that. Someone has to decide what's the software development lifecycle methodology, the SDLC, that will be used, whether that's an agile or a classic waterfall. Again, that's not for me to say, but the reality is speed is important, and that's why we go into the agile space often in this area. So all of this to say that DevOps really is simply a popular term to describe all of the above, which is something that pretty much everyone on this call is going to agree with to some extent. It's not just about automation. It's not just about agile. It's actually all of the above. And it's a popular term to describe the goodness of improving the flow and the value creation in a continuous improvement mindset. Now, that's me saying this from the point of view of where I'm coming from. And my background, of course, is the service management community, but also in the lean premise. But even those in the DevOps community have, some of the same beliefs. So, here's an interesting quote out of a report from Puppet. It says, if you got really fast at all of the development side of it, you didn't actually have the sustaining service management principles in place, ways to move things to production in such a way that you don't take down the house of cards, not good. Not good things aren't going to happen. So it's important that you just don't speed up without having the groundwork of things like just good version control practices. The reality is you need certain things to be at a mature enough level to actually allow you to improve your velocity. So this kind of now takes us to a place of now tying together this in a way that is easy to understand. I want to now talk to the concept of functional versus non-functional requirements. So functional requirements, those are the things we discussed earlier that's going to come from your user stories. The person you're talking to says, I have a vision, I have a dream, and that dream looks like this, and this thing will allow me to do this and that, and I can go there. These are all wonderful. These are the features that the thing must provide. In the ITIL world, we call these the utility aspects, the thing it must do. However, non-functional or warranty is just as critical. Imagine you're going to a party, you get to that party real fast, and you realize that you get to the party and you have no clothes. Okay, awkward moment. We got to the party, but we're missing something critical here. So the reality of this is, and Craig, I think you said this yesterday, it depends on what kind of party, but the reality is, most of the time, having clothes would be a good thing to do. The interesting thing is, again, if you deliver on all of your user stories, which are feature-based, but you put the company out of business, or you end up putting your CFO in a very uncomfortable orange jumpsuit, no one's going to thank you for that either. So the sprint must also be inclusive of the non-functional requirements. So how do we get that done? So here's a way to look at this whole kind of value stream in the premise of a horizontal value creation entity. So these are service management / ITIL processes on the outside. On the inside of the nugget here is your SDLC, your development methodology. And it doesn't matter what you plug in there, whether it's agile or whatever build method you want. That's definitely where new value is created. But before I begin that, I have to have a set of engagement processes. So this is my storefront. So I have strategic dialogue with a customer around business relationship management. It's kind of account management function. Where do you want to go? Where is this organization going in a strategic future, etc. I have an ordering analysis on my catalog. What's being ordered? What's not being ordered? What people like, what people don't like. I have people calling the service desk, complaining, asking for support, but basically they're giving me a sense of how things are currently being used, how they're currently being experienced, and all of these can be considered demand inputs into a set of strategic processes that says, here are the offerings, the services, the outcomes we deliver today. Here's the current cost. We're in a growth period, so this is our investment strategy. Or we're in a commoditization period for the organization, so we have to start pulling out cost and improving margins by optimization and standardization. Or we're in a declining scenario and we have to do so even more. But all of this dialogue would set priorities for your project activities and prioritization. What you don't want is just to have 100 different user stories coming from 20 different channels. None of those channels are prioritized in the context of the larger business strategy and dialogue, because you could get really high velocity on stuff that really doesn't matter in the larger scheme of things. So this is critical that your chartering of your product backlog is also being informed of on the concept of the voice of the business premise. Now, let's say we're moving along, the engine room is starting to go. And by the way, even the premise of a factory concept makes certain people in IT squirm. They say, well, hey, we're not a factory, we're craftsmen. I'd like you to reevaluate that for a moment, because you get demand in one side, you build stuff and you put it out the other. Now, yes, it's squishy in the middle, but the reality is it's still a demand and supply mechanism. People get all upset. Well, we don't want to be order takers. Again, examine that for a moment. The reality is we're a service organization, and the way we basically make a living is receiving orders. It's just we want to be a strategic partner, not a widget provider. But the reality is the day orders stop coming in, the day we all go out of business. So we're a demand and supply business that has to operate like one. That means we understand our supply chain. So anyway, I digress. But here we go. We're continuing to build out, but I have to think about non-functional requirements like disaster recovery. What's the requirement in our co-location or hot data center? Security. How do I protect all of the data in the information? What about suppliers? What contracts and integration do I need for suppliers on this model? So what you got is a conveyor belt that's basically feeding into the sprint the non-functional requirements, fit for purpose, right level, right, not overburdening. But without this, we may not basically keep that person out of jail, so that's important. And then at the point we're now coming into production, I've got all of these trains, planes, and automobiles moving to the same basic runway called the data center, called production, and they have to be orchestrated in such a way that we can handle high volumes of input to production in the most effective, efficient, low-friction way, but it's simply not everybody goes and does their own thing. Because if you all had all of these changes coming in and there was no coordination or orchestration of all of this, it's like multiple planes coming in at the same runway without a common control tower. Eventually, you're going to have an uncomfortable situation. Ideally, then we get this into production, and now, of course, we're supporting this. When it breaks, we throw the people out onto the truck, and they go out and they fix the thing. And because this experience is going to inform us about how this went, ideally, we're moving our lessons learned back, and we get better at this higher velocity, lower defect, and we improve flow. So this is where we understand the integration of service management, which is on the outside rim here, and build practices have to integrate. And to ensure that we have optimized flow, we don't simply say, let's throw the full book at this. Remember, go back to that dial. I have the right level of formality for the right practice for the right reason. Nothing is hard right, but you don't want it all hard left into make to stock either, but there has to be a balancing act between them. So kind of closing up here, we're talking about this whole plan build aspect. And a key thing about plan build is that we have to find a way to release and deploy in an optimum way. And this is what I called earlier kind of a low friction path to production. Now we can do that in a number of different ways. If we are using more standardized artifacts, pre-approved scripts and pre-approved virtual objects, pre-approved virtual environments, literally I can move a lot of that to quote unquote pre-approved so that a lot of the testing and validation from a release perspective is done on a once and done perspective. And then from that point, they become more of a standard change. So the key to improving velocity to move to production is to get a release practice that basically understands when things are optimized to standard and when things need to have a little bit of a slower path to production. So this concept, by the way, is compatible with the premise of the DevOps trunk and branching strategy. So think of it this way. So here's my main trunk for my code. And so I'm continuously basically integrating all of the updates to my code repository using good version control, software configuration management. And on a regular basis, if it's small, if it's minor, if it's an issue related to service restoration, I'm continually integrating and deploying. So that's where my CI/CD is going on a rapid basis and maybe releasing dozens, hundreds of updates to production on a daily basis. Because I have an architected system that allows for automatic testing, and the ability to roll back if I get a mistake there is quite now mature because I have the ability through good source control to roll back rapidly. However, there are times when the feature set is a little larger, we're going to do a branch. And so we're going to pull out from the code base, the current code base at that moment, and we'll then begin working on a larger set of features. We might be releasing this to a non-production environment for small batch, quicker feedback loops. Probably going to have a few more basically refreshes of the code base than I'm showing here. But right before, of course, you go live, you're at least going to update with the most recent trunk version of your code so you can do good integration testing. And now I'm going to release back into the trunk this new branch feature. This allows me to have a little bit more due diligence, perhaps a bit more testing, perhaps a bit more qualification of assurance. So it's not perhaps automated, but the reality is, well, automated in deployment, yes, but the reality is we probably have some manual balances and checks as well they wouldn't have for the smaller, less risk-based changes. So this premise of low and higher risk allows us to understand different levels of due diligence based on different size of risk on the branch versus CI/CD. All of the time, we're improving flow, improving velocity to get faster, because the last thing you want is a change process, which in itself becomes the bottleneck. But to make sure that it's not a bottleneck, you have to have moved a lot of this to a standard automated basis. So that comes to the final slide, and I'm going to turn it back over to my friend Craig here, is, DevOps talks a lot about automation. A lot of the tooling around DevOps is focused on automation. And, ServiceNow has a great offer in the service orchestration place to do this. But the key of automation, as I mentioned earlier, is that you have predefined objects, scripts that represent the, standard pre-approved object for virtual machine or environment. And as long as those artifacts are being used, then we get the basis of automation. We get the benefit of automated flow through change management because of the predefined and pre-approved changes. But the promise of automation comes with the price of moving the dial from that custom, engineered order further to the left, where we get closer to the make to stock. So there is kind of a precursor to that wonderful objective. And with that, Craig, I'm going to turn it over to you. But the last thing I'll say is that, remember, we're on one team. When we don't believe we're on a team and we act like we're just a group of independent agents, it's an unfortunate situation. because when we have silos that go to war, it's a long, hard fall.
Troy, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And thank you so much for. I mean, I think you said there was a lot of content in here that really, I think I loved the summary actually that you gave at the beginning of this webinar when you said that these are really just two sides of the same coin, and one without the other is not going to be useful to you in the long term, and probably not even in the short term for that matter. We did get some questions in, and we're going to get to some of those in just a second. Before we do that, I wanted to just put a couple of thoughts out there. First of all, ServiceNow and Pink Elephant have been working together for a long time. This is actually an award that we won from Pink Elephant for our work around SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle, back in 2010. You can tell it's an old award because of the date and because of that pesky hyphen between service and now, and because Pink Elephant at that time was Silver Elephant. Maybe they weren't really. But yeah, we've been working together for a long time, and it's great to be able to work with Troy on things like this and get his insight into really important topics like DevOps and ITOps. But I do want to speak for a moment, too, about ServiceNow's capabilities in these areas. Obviously, this is a ServiceNow webinar, and so I wanted to speak briefly about that. When we talk about agile delivery automation, there are a series of process areas that you must touch to take a service from development to operation, and that series is a cycle. And as a business needs to continually improve and add new capabilities, as Troy spoke about, our service delivery cycle just supports the way that business needs to operate. So on this slide, the red boxes across the top represent planning and support capabilities that ServiceNow provides to make sure you're working on the right things and you're maintaining compliance and managing risk. The blue boxes represent the core processes that take the idea into production and enable continuous improvement. And then the orange boxes at the bottom represent automation activities. Troy mentioned a few of these. And the idea of these can help reduce risk and increase efficiency by using the information, process management, and controls set up in the top two layers to ensure that automation has all the information and context required in order to deliver the correct result. Now, in the bottom left of the slide, you can see a box titled Integration and Orchestration, and this is really just about the idea that ServiceNow is not and cannot be the only technology in a DevOps environment. There are other capabilities, continuous integration, source code management, automated testing, last mile automation tools. These things are already in play in every organization. And so what we do at ServiceNow is we integrate with them so that you use our orchestration capabilities, and then those tools become the backplane of the delivery system. To illustrate that backplane concept in more detail, think of the process areas we talked about before. At the top, at the bottom we list an example set of DevOps tools that are already in play for many organizations and required to deliver the product. These are like the hammer, the welder, the things in that factory's assembly line. And by the way, I completely agree with Troy's comments on factory there. We can swap out the tools at the stations to change the type of product that we deliver. The challenge that these tools present is that they are usually built for focused purposes. Many, started off as open source with a goal of solving a particular challenge for a team, and then they grew in capability from there. While there are a host of tools for each phase of the process, most organizations lack a platform for the tools to plug in and share information. For example, we see build engineering teams spinning up custom apps and scripts just to build a pipeline, resulting in a range of wildly different pipelines across an organization. With operations often being a shared function, having all those different pipelines can cause a big problem when you start looking at transitioning to production. So what we're talking about and the way that we position ServiceNow around this whole story is that ServiceNow is the orchestration and integration framework that all of these other tools plug into. ServiceNow is certainly not the be-all and end-all in this space. We work with all of these other technologies. And then what ServiceNow allows you to do is then report on any stage of delivery, to effectively automate using context from across the pipeline, and to help deliver an efficient transition to operations by natively supporting the incident and problem change steps that are required to sort of move forward. So these are, that's kind of how ServiceNow fits into this story. I didn't want to spend an enormous amount of time talking about ServiceNow because I think Troy's topic of ITOps versus DevOps is really what we wanted to focus on. But I just wanted to bring a little context in there toward the end, just to make sure that that you understood sort of how ServiceNow fits into this story. Of course, the other place that you can go to learn a lot about what ServiceNow is doing in this space, and to hear speakers talk about topics like DevOps and ITOps, is Knowledge 16. Knowledge 16 is coming up in May in Las Vegas. There are going to be around 10,000 people there, all talking about service management, and talking about the idea of experiencing a service revolution, which absolutely starts at that operations level and moves all the way through IT, and then it moves out into the rest of the business as well. And this year at Knowledge, you're going to hear a lot of presentations that are, nothing to do with IT, but they're covering areas where people are automating those service management processes using ServiceNow, inside IT, outside IT, and right at that operations level as well. So another great place to go if you're looking for more information about service management or ServiceNow, or if you want to engage with other people. I mean, to me, that's the biggest benefit of Knowledge, is the fact that you get to meet other people just like you who are facing similar problems, similar challenges, let's say. So, with that, what I'd like to do, Troy, if it's okay with you, is come to a couple of questions. We've had a couple come in during the course of the webinar. The first one that came in was from John. He said that he's heard elsewhere that infrastructure is code and should be treated as such. Can you explain what that means in practice?
Yeah, so this is the move towards virtualization. We saw this going back a couple of years now when we moved from internal virtualization. Now we're looking at external cloud-based offers around services like compute and hosting and storage and network, etc. So what has been happening through, of course, the last decade is more and more of the traditional hardware is moving from the technical perspective of I can touch it and feel it to more virtual objects within a larger environment. So going back, in essence, back to the mainframe days of virtual LPARs, but the reality is much of what we have been used to deploying and putting out there in the sense of the total system is now moving to virtual. And when these things become virtual, I can now basically script them and configure them using scripts and basically programming language. So in essence, the predominance of our quote-unquote infrastructure now used in service management is going to be a virtual object versus an infrastructure. It's not all of this is a hard infrastructure. Of course, it's not all that way at the moment, but the unquestionable trend is that it's moving more and more to that. So the server administrator better become a good code jockey, because that's the future of her industry.
All right. Fantastic. Another question came in from Mark, who was asking what the offering was for automation and whether that was a ServiceNow product. Troy, I'm not going to make you answer that one. The answer to that is yes. It is. There is a ServiceNow product that manages that automation, and it is called ServiceNow Orchestration. You can find more details about that on the just on the ServiceNow website. But the word to look for is orchestration, and that will tell you all about that offering. Another question came in from Simone. She asked, to what extent can you apply DevOps when you're dealing with SaaS solutions?
So DevOps is primarily, I think, focused on SaaS. So software as a service is this virtualization conversation we just had. So remember, DevOps is more than just automation. And go back to that slide where I had that whole range of things. That basically is what DevOps means today. And by the way, DevOps has been evolving in its term. So while it might have started kind of like around the change release premise, it's now much broader because it has to be. But the reality is SaaS allows me to have infrastructure as code, which allows me to get into automated orchestration and provisioning. So that's getting into the automating of the continuous integration and deployment aspect.
All right. Okay. Another question came in from David, said your diagram had Puppet and Chef listed under production. Would they also be used in dev? Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. We see Puppet and Chef being used right across sort of that cycle. People certainly use them in production to do things like ensure that their configuration items are actually configured and are running the right applications that they think they're running by using the CMDB as a gold master. But absolutely, you can also run automation with them in dev on the dev end of the scale as well. So that most certainly happens. Another question that came in, and this one's for you, Troy, from Roof, asked. He said, "I think I heard you say that we need to deliver value at the feature and project level, not at the user story level, because the user story level includes both functional and non-functional value." Is that correct?
Not exactly. My words were that the user story will normally focus on functional and not consider non-functional requirements. Now, that's not always true, but in my experience, that is predominantly true. So that's where the user story is going to capture your voice of customer, your VOC. But you also have to consider the VOB aspect and the VOR, the voice of business and regulation, and any process. So the non-functional elements are not going to normally come from a user story dialogue. It has to be put in, or the user stories which deal with non-functional, put it that way, have to be usually brought in through other means. And so that could be service management roles or processes, or functional teams like the security team or the architecture group.
Right. Yep. No, that makes complete sense. Troy, I think with that, we do have. There's a couple of other questions, and I think we'll come back to them via email. But with that, I think we've kind of come to the end of our time, and I wanted to thank you particularly for joining us and for being part of the webinar and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom around DevOps and ITOps. Really appreciate you working with us on this. And also, I'd love to thank all of the attendees for joining us on the webinar this morning. And just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, and so you look out for a link in your email so that you can share it with any of your colleagues who maybe weren't able to attend, or if you wanted to go back and revisit part of it, you'll have an opportunity to do that as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Troy, and we'll see you next time.